the Officer of the Order of Canada, was a Federal Minister of Industry, Premier Newfoundland, Ministry of Fisheries here. Today, Vice Chairman of BMO. You're on.
So last year when I came in and participated with the discussion in the class, Ralph asked me to take a few minutes to talk a little bit about how I came to be involved in the political life of Canada, and subsequently over the years became involved in the business community of Canada. And so we did that, and we had a bit of a Q&A, which I found actually was the best part of the day, certainly for me, and I hope it was an informative part of the day for those who were here last year. But a little bit about myself. I'm somebody who got involved in politics at a fairly young age. It's interesting, David McNaughton just left the room, because David was the executive assistant to Don Jamieson, and Don Jamieson was the Minister of Foreign Affairs for Canada way back when, and he left the government of Canada to come back and seek to be elected as Premier of Newfoundland, and he inherited me at the age of 23 as his new executive assistant. So he went from working with David to working with me, and as a young EA, I got the task of working with somebody who at the time was one of Canada's most really interesting political characters, a great orator, great mind, longtime Minister of Foreign Affairs, very effective on the world stage for Canada. He's deceased now, but he would be amused today to see that David's the the ambassador for Canada to the United States and trying to make sense of what Don Trump is doing, which is probably an impossible task for anybody.
You call him Don Trump?
Oh, President Trump, President Trump.
No, I call him Donald.
Donald.
But I'd never heard Don.
Well, you used to work for him.
I did.
So you're far more respectful of him than I am, and he's closer to your political idiom than mine.
In some ways.
In some ways. So I was a 23-year-old working for Don Jamieson, and Mr. Jamieson called me in one day and said, there's going to be a by-election over in Western Newfoundland, and I want you to go over on my behalf and meet with this list of, this is the not very glorious way I got involved in politics, meet with this list of 7 or 8 candidates, and Ralph knows all about this with his own deep experience in politics, and we're going to want to talk and see who might be interested in seeking the Liberal nomination. Now, the reason we were trying to talk people into it is the riding had not been Liberal for more than 2 decades. It had been a solid conservative bastion. Your old friend Jack Marshall, Senator Jack Marshall, was the MP. Nobody really expected we were going to win the seat. So my job was to go over and try and entice, on behalf of the Liberal leader, someone to run for Mr. Trudeau in 1980. I got over there with my list, and I went through the list, and everybody was very sympathetic, very respectful, very appreciative and flattered to be asked, but determined not to run. So rather than go back to my boss in St. John's and tell him that we couldn't find a candidate, I in fact called him up instead and said I had found a candidate, not very experienced, not very seasoned, but what he lacked in experience and seasoning, he made up for in passion and enthusiasm and energy. And he said, well, what happened to Bill? I said, Bill said no. He said, what happened to George? I said, George said no. What happened to Harvey? I said, Harvey said no. I said, well, who the hell's this guy? I said, me. He said, you? I said, yeah, me. He said, they all said no? I said, they all said no. He said, well, you are a very loyal servant, and I really appreciate it. And I'm glad you're going to do this and run, and I want to assure you, I said, yes, that your job will still be here when this election's over. So there was my less than glorious start to political life. We got involved in a campaign, started with no organization, no workers, no effective Liberal Party structure anywhere in the place, and spent the first, those days it was a 56-day campaign. So I spent the first 20, 25 days literally organizing the riding. And we had a fun and high-energy campaign. We had all brand new people. We were running against a young guy named Fons Fowler, who was the first ever NDPer ever elected in Newfoundland. He was affectionately called the Fons, and we beat him. It was a bit of an upset victory. It wasn't expected to happen. Fons was a great guy. Had he been either a conservative or a Liberal, he'd still be elected today. But he just happened to be running that time when the NDP was still new and Newfoundland was not able to hang on to the seat. So a bit of an upset victory, came into the House at 25 years of age. And I want you to know I came with all kinds of confidence, all kinds of great knowledge, and all kinds of determination. I made a great first impression my first day. I'm walking around Parliament Hill. I'm looking around, and I remember I was looking up at the Peace Tower with some wonder and amazement, and this gentleman stopped me and said, "Who are you, young man?" He had kind of a very distinct stutter, which is known to a lot of Canadians who have political interests like Ralph. And I said, "I'm Brian Tobin," rather proudly. He said, "Oh, good." He said, "You're a new MP?" And I said, "Yes, I am," even more proudly. And then I looked at him for a bit and I said, "Who are you?" And he said, "Well, I'm Alan J. McEachin. I'm the Deputy Prime Minister of Canada." A second, very inauspicious start to my political career. I was not off to a good start. But frankly, a lot of political careers, more than you'd like to believe, start that way. Within a year or so, I was the chairman of the Atlantic Caucus. Within 2 years, I was chairman of the National Caucus of the Liberal Party of Canada. I became a cabinet minister in '93, as you will know, as Minister of Fisheries and Oceans, got involved in something called the so-called Turbot War, which was to assert Canadian sovereignty out to the 200-mile zone, stop overfishing, seek a change or amendment to the UN Law of the Sea, which we successfully did. Went back to my own province of Newfoundland and Labrador, became Premier. Was involved in '95, the year before that, in the referendum campaign, Quebec's determination or self-determination insofar as Quebec was concerned as to whether it would remain in Canada or not. Was involved in organizing something called the Montreal Rally. Became Premier in '96, Premier again in '99, back to federal politics in 2000, Minister of Industry, and I retired 16 and a half years ago. I was 47 years of age. I've been elected consecutively for 22 years, federally, provincially. Been through 3 referendum campaigns, 80, 95, and a provincial referendum campaign that put an end, as you will know, to denominational education in Newfoundland and Labrador. And at 47, really came to the realization that I'd done pretty well everything I could do in political life. I'd been around for a long time. I was very good at getting elected. I think I was involved in a number of issues that had a measure of risk attached to them. But you know, if you don't take a measure of risk, you don't get a measure of gain. If you're not prepared to risk something, you can't win something. And something meaningful, something important. And you want your time, for those of you who get involved in political life at some point in your life, or any other form of activity, you want it to mean something. You know, you don't want to just take the safe, cautious, boring passage. You want to try and be a game changer a little bit in whatever it is you do in life. And I was satisfied that I'd had a number of those kind of events. And I also recognized that if I was ever going to have another life post-politics, at 47, it was time to move on and get into the world of business. So I left political life, a little bit of a surprise to many that I did at 47. I thought I was getting tired and burned out and old. Everybody else thought I was still young and wondered why I was going. But I poured my energy then into business here, came to Bay Street, came to Toronto, got involved with a law firm as a senior business advisor. I had the flexibility within the firm to be involved in building businesses, and Ralph, as you said, me and a group of investors were involved in buying a directory company, put $35 million into it, sold it for a couple of $100 million on behalf of our shareholders. We bought a cable company, bought it for $330 million, raised capital, interestingly enough, first capital always in the US, not in Canada, second round in Canada. Sold that for $975 million 30 months later. Started a little iron ore company, was a penny stock, and literally started at 10 cents a share, and sold that for $5 billion after 4 years, and raised $1.23 billion, built the infrastructure out, sent the first ships to China, caught the top of the market for iron ore, and that became a very globally successful transaction. And after all of that, the Bank of Montreal had come knocking a few times, and so for 5 years now, I've been a vice chair at BMO Capital Markets. So I'm a lucky person in that I've had an opportunity to have an interesting and challenging and fulfilling political career.
And hang out with me.
And hang out with Ralph, my favorite conservative. And at the same time, to have an interesting and fascinating business career that's allowed me to move north and south, east and west, and around the world, find co-investors and interested players and partners, you know, as far afield as China. Today, I serve on 3 corporate boards. I'm the chairman of the board of a company called New Flyer Industries. New Flyer is the largest bus manufacturer in North America. It's about 50% of the market share of both heavy-duty transit buses and intercity buses. We're based in Winnipeg, but we've got plants in the U.S., so we're protected from the sort of, America First legislation that has arisen and the sentiment that has arisen. I'm the chairman of the board of a company called Element Fleet. It's the largest fleet company in the world. We have 3 million vehicles in our fleet today. We've got an $18 billion stack of debt supporting all of those vehicles of every kind. We're Toronto-based. And I'm the chairman of the board of a company called Aecon Construction. Aecon is the largest publicly traded construction company in Canada, and we've just done a deal to sell Aecon to CCCI, a division of CCCC, a huge China construction conglomerate. It's 60 in the global 500, $80 billion of revenues, huge players. We think they're going to be a fantastic partner for Aecon and allow us to be not only larger players in Canada, North America, but to be much larger players around the world. So the dance card's pretty full. Life is interesting. Canada's still, for me, the most, even with its challenges, having President Trump, as a neighbor, still the best country in the world in which to live and grow, be educated. Hope that some of the great minds that are here will spend some time contributing to Canada if and when you are contemplating going back to home countries. We certainly I appreciate in particular the diversity of this class, both folks from across the country and folks from around the world.
Thank you so much, Brian, for coming. I have a question regarding the chromite mine known as the Ring of Fire. It's been over 10 years since the discovery, as you're well aware, and barely any progress has been made to develop it at this time. An announcement made in Thunder Bay on August 21, Kathleen Wynne announced the governmental support for the roadway and that they will begin the environmental assessments in January of next year. In this announcement, she explained that the government has received a lot of criticism about why it's been taking so long, and she said that it has been a very slow and careful process because there are, quote, not a lot of great examples of resource development and benefit sharing with First Nations in Canada, end quote. I personally don't accept this excuse because I believe that there are many examples, both good and bad, of this, especially when we look at mining examples in the Northwest Territories, oil sands in Alberta, or even the forestry industry across Canada. So my question is, and it relates to this promise, in that it's coming to us less than a year before the next provincial election. And many think that this project has been stalled in order to help with the Liberal campaign, and this announcement has come out for that very purpose. I ask this question to you, not only because of your extensive experience in the mining industry, but also because you've been the premier, you have governmental experience, and above all, you sit as the chairman of Aecon, who has also been working on the Ring of Fire project. So do you believe that this announcement is a coincidence, or do you think that there are other reasons for this over 10-year delay of construction to even begin on this project?
Yeah, so I know a fair amount about the Ring of Fire project less because of Aecon, to be blunt, we're a construction company, but more because of my interest and time in the mining industry.
Can I just, does everyone know what the Ring of Fire is? You do, okay.
So the Ring of Fire is just a geographic zone in northern Ontario, and within the Ring of Fire is the chromite deposit that you talked about, but there are also gold, copper, iron ore, multiple kinds of precious metals and other metals deposits within this huge geographic zone. So the short answer is no, I don't think the project was deliberately delayed. In fact, if you were interested as a government in holding up the Ring of Fire as an example of the government doing the right thing, following the right policy, you'd want it going a long time ago. You'd actually want jobs, you'd want benefits, you'd want IBAs with First Nations communities, you'd want First Nations communities being partners in development long before now. So I can tell you there's no deliberate holding up of the project. What really happened to that project? And I just want to come back to, I mentioned the Consolidated Thompson Iron Mines project. That project we sold for $5 billion, as Ralph well knows, and Ralph knows a fair amount about the mining industry as a practicing lawyer. We sold that project for $5 billion. Within 2 years, that project was shut down. Because when we sold Consolidated Thompson, iron ore prices were $175 a ton. They actually peaked at $225 a ton. And within 2 years, because of an oversupply by the big three players, and because of a beginning of a contraction in terms of usage of iron ore, in particular in China, the end of the big boom, infrastructure boom, iron ore prices cratered. They went all the way back down to $40. So that project we sold actually has gone today to care and maintenance. It's still in care and maintenance. Another company's bought it. They have just enough money to keep it alive, not allow things to rust and fall apart. And they've just raised, just very recently, in the last month or two, $400 million to begin to restart that process. And that's all built. That's $1.2 billion of capital finished. So what happened to the chromite deposit? Well, first of all, you're right. They had to have a road to resources. That wasn't even built. Yeah. But secondly, the prices of all of these metals and the cost of developing these metals, of bringing electricity, bringing a processing facility, et cetera, all of that was made mute by the fact that you had a turn down in commodity prices. And that, frankly, is the reason that project didn't go ahead. It's the reason my project that we built, brand new technology, best in class everything, actually got shut down. It was no longer economic. And it'll come back. Yeah. And the Ring of Fire will come back. But the real determination, always, politicians would sometimes like you to believe the opposite, that they can control the destiny, the evolution, creation of resource development. But the real determination are prices. Same reason why there's a downturn in Western Canada in terms of oil and gas drilling and development, prices. Okay. And it's really not more complicated than that. And if I were Kathleen Wynne and I wanted to have an announcement, I would have wanted to have it 2 years ago. And I want something happening by now, but that just wasn't possible.
Where's Damla?
So in the early 1990s, you became a hero while you were the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans. You campaigned heavily against foreign fleets overfishing in the Grand Banks area, an area that is outside Canada's 200 nautical mile fishing zone. During the Turbot War incident in the 1990s, you were mainly responsible for managing the conflict under EU orders. Spain was forced to leave the disputed area, and Canada's right to eject foreign fishing vessels from the area using military force was accepted. At the same time, you were very involved in the Hibernia oil field, which started oil production in 1997. While this jump-started the oil and gas industry in Newfoundland and Labrador and contributed significantly to the economy of the province, why promote a practice that has the potential to do much more harm than overfishing in the event of a spill?
I think it's a very good question, and it is exactly what we should be asking ourselves when we look at developments like oil and gas in sensitive environmental areas like the North Atlantic. And I'm very proud to tell you, yes, I was Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador when we had first oil in 1997, November of 1997. I was the head of the government that negotiated not only the conclusion and go-ahead for Hibernia, but we also did Terra Nova and White Rose. So there's 3 active fields now offshore, and they're all 300 plus kilometers offshore. And it's a very dangerous environment. And so the issue is, can you have, on the one hand, the maintenance, protection of something as sensitive and as important and as renewable as the fishery coexist alongside something that's non-renewable? The fact of the matter is, when we finish a well, it's done. It doesn't replenish itself, but you can find more wells. And I think we came to the conclusion, and I think we're now 20 years later on, that it's possible to do both. But you can't do it cheaply. You can't do it on the cheap. You can't do it by cutting corners. And so the management of the offshore in terms of the safety facilities, the maintenance programs, the monitoring systems, both ships and airborne monitoring systems, the management, and this is really quite fascinating, of icebergs from the moment that the iceberg calves in the north, breaks off, and gets out into the Atlantic as sea ice in the Labrador Current. We're literally monitoring every single piece of ice, because the nightmare scenario, as you will know, in the Newfoundland offshore, these are not floating rigs. Hibernia is not a floating rig. It's a gravity-based system. The Hibernia platform is based on the ocean floor. So if some big iceberg is coming at it, it can't move. You can't uncouple it like a floating production rig. And so you need to be able to make sure that you're not going to have a million-ton iceberg run into it. It's actually designed to take a hit from a million-ton iceberg. I've always said I never want to find out if that's true, if it can take it. So we actually monitor every piece of ice. We manage every piece of ice. These things are so big. This building would be dwarfed by the size of some of these bergs. I mean, the entire building and the block. Some of these icebergs are, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 stories high. if you take them from the bottom into the top. Only 10% of the berg actually shows above water. So when you see these pictures of these massive monoliths in the Atlantic Ocean, you're seeing 10% of the berg. So what do? We manage those. From the day they break off and get into sea ice and get into the Labrador Current, every one of them is separately monitored. And if any one of them is moving in the direction of any one of the offshore operating platforms, they are met not days in advance, not hours in advance, but weeks, sometimes a month in advance, and their direction is changed. They literally put a tow rope on them and they move them. And if you move it at a half a degree or a degree, you change the potential impact point by, a quarter mile, half a mile, 2 miles away from the rig. So I guess what I would want to say to you is somebody who invested a lot of his personal credibility, not political credibility, personal credibility, in putting on a hell of a fight on behalf of Canadians to stop the destruction of offshore fish stocks. I would not be a party to a development that was done in a way that I thought would put those fish stocks, because they are renewable, at risk. And I was satisfied at the end. And we probably cost the companies a hell of a lot more money than they planned to spend initially to build in that margin, extra margins of safety. But here we are, we're decades later, and we've not had a spill. We've not had an incident. So I would simply say your question's valid, it's legitimate, and it should continue to be asked, and the public should continue to demand an answer. And that's the one I offer you today.
How important and what weight do you give to social impact investing? He said the answer that I would give, 0. I'm looking at, is the product good? Can I make money?
In some areas, that might be the technology, it might be the answer. But frankly, in the context of Canada, and think about Canada as a massive, incredibly rich resource warehouse. In the context of getting access to the resources of the land of Canada, I think the social license is absolutely critical.
And I agree with that.
I
agree. You're on the same page.
Let me
I
go a
agree.
step further.
Okay.
So Consolidated Thompson Iron Mines would never have happened when we had a grand total of $7 million in the bank. By the way, $7 million against a $1.2 billion bill is a pittance. It's barely spare change. So we didn't have a lot of money. We were a penny stock. We were on the venture exchange. We were barely, we were a flea on Bay Street. We only had $7 million. I went to the First Nations communities who might be affected by our development, in fact, who didn't live within 200 kilometers of our development, but who historically may well have lived on that land or hunted on that land. And we found them and we gave them $1 million and said, go hire the very best lawyer. Now, you can't argue with this as a lawyer.
Or if you could have hired me, geez, I'm in.
No,
CSR, I loved it here. They hired me.
We did say the very best lawyer.
Oh, now my students love me. Thank you very much. That was a shot. We caught him, this guy, Tobin.
He's a good friend of mine. I can get away with that. I probably won't get a cigar after this class, but I got one last year. We said, hire the very best lawyer because we want to make a deal with you. We want you to be our partner in this iron ore development. We know you're going to do a search and to tell us why you have a claim on the land, so don't bother. Here's the money. We're not even funded yet. Go and do your homework. Prepare, because we're going to make a deal with you. You're going to be a partner with us. We're going to run IBAs with you, impact benefit agreements. We're going to run JVs with you. Any supplier to our mine, whether it's a helicopter company, airline company, people providing fuel, services, are going to run JVs. And every one of those JVs is going to have an Aboriginal component. We gave them a vested interest in the success of this project and a capacity to be, in a sense, on the inside rather than the outside, inside, looking at how we're going to do it. And as a result of that mine, Ralph, which you know well, right up in the Labrador Trough, which required Quebec environmental approval, Newfoundland and Labrador environmental approval, and then federal environmental approval, got moving in 36 months. It was almost a record. Why? Because rather than sit back and force an Aboriginal community or communities to make their case, we actually set out by saying, you're our partner. We just got to define the terms of the partnership. You need the capacity to go and negotiate with us and to have, and by the way, I wanted a negotiation that couldn't be undone later. I want to say you hired a guy down the hall, you didn't really know whether he was experienced or not, go hire the best guy. And we made an agreement, and the reason we were successful with that project is we understood from the get-go there had to be room in the economic rent in that project for the people who lived on the land first. So on the issue of social responsibility, I think that it's not only good policy, but in the context of all of the courses, precedents in the Supreme Court of Canada today that are out there, it's good business. And the two can go hand in hand.
Since the financial crisis, there is an increasing awareness towards social and environmental issues. Businesses of all stripes are now being held accountable for their business, social, and environmental practices. As a result, impact investing, that is, making investments that incorporate or consider the social and environmental considerations of those investments, is now becoming more mainstream. So my main question to you is, what is the Bank of Montreal doing to participate and support impact investing in Canada? And as a follow-up, as BMO Vice Chair, what are some of the roadblocks you have noticed in participating and supporting impact investing?
First of all, I think writ large, whether you're talking about the Bank of Montreal or talking about any of the financial institutions in Canada, or any of the big law firms in Canada, or for that matter, governments of Canada and large corporations writ large, there's a full understanding of the need for, what we just call the social license, and to understand the impact of the investments you make and how they impact communities right across the land, but in particular, and I don't want to keep coming back to this, but in particular, Aboriginal communities. So in the case of the Bank of Montreal, we have a fully dedicated Aboriginal banking group that allow us to go out and look at projects with perhaps a slightly different risk metric we might apply elsewhere. Help us understand that we have an obligation as a financial institution in Canada to enable First Nations communities who are trying to go out and build the kind of partnerships that I talked about just a minute ago, JVs, joint ventures, or if not a JV, to be a straight supplier of goods or services to Canadians generally or to resource industries in particular. So that within the bank, that's clearly a mandate that we pursue, not by telling the various divisions of the bank, be mindful of this in your deliberations, but by creating an active, separate banking arm within the institution whose mandate is to be present, to participate, to take advantage of good business opportunities, obviously, and there are many within Aboriginal Canada, Northern Canada, rural Canada, remote Canada, but also to help build capacity. Because these communities will never have an opportunity to truly be self-sustaining if we're not, all of us, whether it's across the educational spectrum, or across the infrastructure spectrum, or across the business opportunity spectrum, we're not building capacity amongst Aboriginal peoples themselves. You don't want to create dependency. We know what happens with that. It doesn't work. And we also know, and there are lots of examples in Canada, of how powerful and how successful First Nations communities can be when given the tools and given the opportunity. So I guess the answer is I see more and more, whether it's ACON, construction, we build partnerships everywhere, whether it's at the Bank of Montreal, or whether it's at New Flyer Industries, where we live and we're based, headquartered in Winnipeg, one of the biggest Aboriginal communities, urban communities in Canada. We are consciously going out and asking the question, what are we doing to partner with First Nations communities? Can we do more? I can tell you, without telling stories out of school, as the chairman of the board of ACON, at our last meeting when we had a report from our HR officer, I looked at the level of Aboriginal participation in New Flyer and said, not good enough. Next board meeting, come back and tell us what we're doing to actively go out and recruit more First Nations peoples, urban-based peoples, into our plant, for example, in Winnipeg. So I don't think that's unique to the businesses I'm involved with. I think there's if in my own mind, if I compare the attitude to 10, 15 years ago, 10, 15 years ago in business in Canada, I was hearing people saying things like, why do we need to do anything? It's not our responsibility. Why do we need to make a JV? It's not for us to do. That's no longer the case. People are understanding that good business is good impact investing and earning the right to be present and to participate in the life of adjacent communities, whether they're Aboriginal or not Aboriginal, but we owe a debt of citizenship wherever we are in corporate Canada.
Thank you, Mr. Tobin, for coming. In June 2016, Catalyst Canada published a report regarding diversity within boards in Canada. The report generally leads to the conclusion that measures in place are not yielding the desired effects. 11 recommendations to accelerate progress in this area have been proposed, which included reaching a target of 30% women on boards for all issuers that currently have at least one woman director and one woman director for all issuers. So my question is, you have led many companies either as chairman or as a member of the board, and you are current vice chair, investment and corporate banking at BMO Capital Markets. What are your views about increasing women participation in corporate Canada? Do you support having a legislation for quota for women members on the company board, as in line with many European countries? Thank you.
So again, a very good question. I think the short answer is corporate Canada is skating right on the edge of a legislatively mandated requirement for a certain quota of women on boards, because we haven't voluntarily done enough to move the needle for participation of women. And the women participate in all three boards I'm on. In the last board search we did, we hired 2 women in the case of New Flyer. But one of the observations I will give you is this. All of the women that I've worked with on boards, and I can't give you names, but I'll tell you this as a fact, to a person, do not want mandated quotas on the board. They don't-
100%. That's the biggest
To a
issue.
single person, and you know, it's not popular to say that, but it's the truth. And the reason I believe is they really don't want to feel, these are all very accomplished individuals, that they're there because, you know, there was a quota to put them there. So and I asked the question, just like you just asked it, should we just say that's it, it's X%? And they absolutely, to a person,
100%.
well, I don't, you probably find the same, say no. And so you ask, well, why? And you get well, I'm here because I think I earned my way here, and I don't want. Now, that being said, they recognize, certainly I recognize, we've moved the needle, clearly, over the last decade. We haven't moved fast enough. And I guess if I were sitting in government today, as opposed to sitting on corporate boards today, I'd be saying to boards, you're getting the last notice. You've got a very relatively short period of time, I don't know, 24 months. And if at the end of X period of time, you haven't moved the needle to 25 or 30% across the board, then we will do what we have to do to enhance the participation by women on corporate boards. The other comment I'd make to you is it's important not just that women be represented on corporate boards, it's also, because I can tell you I gotta be careful when I say this, a great many of the new members of boards over the last 3 or 4 years in particular have been women. You go looking for women members because most boards have been deficient. But we need women in management too. There's a deficiency there as well. And if you just address the issue of women on boards and you don't consciously address enabling, promoting, recognizing talented women within the ranks of the organization, all the way up through the senior ranks of management of the corporations, then you really haven't done, you've done a job that has a degree of visibility at the board level, but you've failed in terms of diversifying the decision-making matrix. You failed, I'll come right to you, Victoria. You failed because you know, boards are important. They play a critical role. It's an oversight role, but the actual people who drive the machine every day, not once a quarter, or not whenever there's a board call, are the management team. And I personally would like to see a continued increase, greater increase in the number of senior folks, females, in the C-suite.
You say that you would like to see a change and a shuffle there, but what is the tangible plan of action for that? Or what would you recommend to be an effective plan of action for that?
So every corporation of any size has got a succession plan. And a succession plan literally goes through all the key roles, leadership roles in the ELT, executive leadership team, or senior leadership team, depending what they call it, and identify successors for the roles that are there. in the context of who's ready now, who'll be ready in 2 years, who'll be ready in 3 years. I think one of the ways in which that piece of work ought to be done and reviewed by the CEO and then subsequently by the full board is a conscious look at how many women in the organization are coming up through the ranks, how many women are being promoted, and how many women are in succession, or in the succession line. And what work is being done to get these people who have leadership talent and ability ready? Are they being taken out of the workplace, offered up, the 6-week course, 6-month course, whatever happens to be at Harvard or somewhere else, to grow their leadership skills, to grow their preparation for a leadership role? So I can tell you on the boards I'm on, these are questions we ask. That's another layer in the matrix of what we look at in terms of the succession planning of the corporation. I don't know how often that I can tell you at the bank, that is very much present. If you go to the Bank of Montreal today, and to be fair to the other banks, I think you'll see a very big change. I had lunch today with a managing director, who shall remain nameless, but who's only been with the Bank of Montreal 6 months. So was telling me about her program. She's running a certain group. She's a senior leader, and I was asking. She's come out of another bank, a U.S.-based bank, asking the question, what do you see after 6 months in terms of the flight path for you up through the organization? How are you feeling about it? And it's better for me to ask her than to give you my view. And she was pretty positive. I thought it was a good thing. I see it around me, but I, frankly, unless you're out there living, working every day, you don't know whether or not there's a sense of there's room for me in this organization if I put in the time and pay my dues. And so I got a positive response today. My daughter, who will shoot me if she knows I'm talking about her, is 37 years old. She's over at CPPIB. She is an MBA. She's a senior principal there. She came out of Morgan Stanley, RBC, World Bank down in Washington for a couple of years. I talk to her often about what's happening with her age cohort. How do they feel the opportunity is or isn't? What are the challenges of being a young woman, a professional? Including the challenges of the home front, taking a break from work for those years of child raising, all that. Does the workplace recognize that and punish, reward, enhance? What does it do? And so I think we're getting better across a whole bunch of spectrums. I think we'd be foolish not to acknowledge that there's been positive change. Justin Trudeau naming half of his cabinet in one snap was a pretty powerful message at women. But we're not there. Corporate Canada needs to do more.
Okay.
And if we don't voluntarily do more, then we'll deserve something I think nobody wants, including women themselves, which is a legislative result. How do you feel about the issue of quotas? How do you and Martha feel? I saw you both rolling your eyes when this came up. I'm very interested in hearing your view.
I think quotas are a very complicated topic, especially when it comes to women in the workforce, because I would never want to feel like I was filling a woman's seat rather than earning a voice in a room full of equals, or a room full of my professional and academic equals. So I think it's very complicated, but to your point, if people and boards can't make those changes consciously, then it's something that will have to be enforced, or will have to be more formally shaken up, so to speak. Martha?
I think I totally agree with what you and Victoria have both said. In my mind, when you're speaking about doing it voluntarily versus legislation, being part of a target versus a quota is much more palatable to me as having an organization have a target versus having the government say they have to hire me. So I'm in line with both of you.
And then I think we're agreed. We're also agreed that that's not an excuse to do nothing.
My management team knows I'm looking at them. So if you get leadership at the top, the voluntary thing, I am just so worried at the mid-sized companies. I don't worry about Manulife and the companies, and when they get quality board members like you get the mid-cap companies, they're going from meeting to meeting, they're public companies, but they're trying to succeed. I was at a small cap mining company, one of Barty's this morning, and they were all guys. Hello. And they said, you're right. So volunteer, unfortunately, in my view, unless you got 100,000 Tobins and liens to sit on every board, it's not going to happen. So let's go. I got another question that's really important to me because I lost an election on the denominational schools issue in Ontario. And Martha, it's your question is really a good question. Bugs the hell out of me. We should have won a provincial election and we got that silly issue. But so ask him because he handled it differently and you survived. But
Okay. As Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador, your government led the successful initiative to end denominational schools in the province. In an interview from September of this year, you're cited as saying, "Our capacity today with our current economic challenges to run a system like that would have been impossible. Our children would have suffered an inferior education." Ontario is a province that still funds both Catholic and non-denominational schools. The province is also projected to reach $336 billion of debt by 2020. As one of the most diverse provinces in Canada, with school-age students from several faith backgrounds, there's been discussion in the past about whether it's time to end denominational schools in Ontario for reasons of underrepresenting several populations in the province. From your experience, what are the main factors that should drive the initiative to close denominational schools? Is it purely finance-driven, or should accurate representation of the people in the province play a role?
So in the case of Newfoundland, there had been, prior to my becoming Premier in 1996, multiple attempts made in negotiations between the denominational education committees, these are the churches, and the government to rationalize public expenditure in education. So for the background of those who don't understand what the denominational education system was, what it meant was there were Catholic schools, there were Protestant schools, there were Pentecostal schools. And what happened in Newfoundland is that each of the church groups and each of the church leaders really became very possessive of their system. So you'd have the odd circumstance that a community over here that had a Catholic school would be taking the Protestant children out of that community, small rural communities, and putting them on a bus and driving them an hour over here to the Protestant school. And the Catholic kids over here were getting on a bus and driving an hour that way to the Catholic school. And it was happening all over the province. Massive amount of busing, massive amount of time and transport and winter conditions in Newfoundland and Labrador. Buildings half empty or a third empty. No capital for classrooms, computers, technology, industrial arts, but lots of money to keep the lights on in buildings that were half empty because people were being bussed all over the place. And no capacity through successive governments of several political stripes to negotiate because everybody was hanging on to their piece of turf. And I recognized when I became Premier, having said, well, I'll try and negotiate this so we have a sensible education system, so we put the money in the classroom, not on a bus, money in technology, not in gasoline. I'm going to negotiate this. And I'm going to tell the denominational education communities we have to get there. Now, I was the first Catholic elected in Newfoundland post-Confederation. There's never been a Catholic Premier. And so it was very difficult to accuse me of being anti-Catholic in insisting that the system be rationalized. And I knew that. And I tried to negotiate a settlement so that we put the focus on education, and we couldn't get there. So I called a referendum. And under the terms of union of Newfoundland joining Canada in 1949, the rights of the churches were entrenched in the Constitution of Canada. So you couldn't legislate the rights away. You couldn't just say, I'm removing your rights. They were in the Constitution of Canada. And the only way to change the Constitution of Canada is to have mirror legislation in the House of Commons and in the legislature to whom it applies. That's the amending formula. And then you can make an amendment to the Constitution affecting any one province. So I had a big job to try and end this denominational system. It didn't require a referendum, but it required an act of the legislature of Newfoundland, and I had to convince the House of Commons to pass a similar act. Now, I knew my problem in the House of Commons was that Ontario had a separate school system, and that the Ontario MPs would be lobbied hard, in particular by the Catholic Church, not to pass the Newfoundland Amendment, because if they did, they'd say that's the slippery slope Ontario is going to be next. Now, in Newfoundland, we were doing it primarily for reasons of efficiency, for reasons of rational expenditure of dollars, for reasons of trying to create a quality education system rather than running everybody all over the place in buses. But I knew that I had to have a powerful message to convince Ottawa to move on this. So I called a referendum. It wasn't required. And rather than take the view of it's not for me to comment, it's up to you, public, you go ahead and decide, I campaigned hard. I made the case, just like I'm making it here, as to why it was important to have a rational public education system. I was very clear that if the public gave me their support in a referendum, that I would not only amend the rights of the churches, I would eliminate them. They would have none. Zero. No legal rights in the schools of Newfoundland and Labrador. That religion would be taught on a basis that every religion would be explored, every tenet of faith would be looked at, but schools wouldn't be one denomination or another. That every child's diversity would be respected. 73% of the people of Newfoundland, in a referendum, historic referendum, voted to eliminate the rights of the churches and to put their money and their faith in investing in the best quality education system we could have. It was an extraordinary result. In a province that's 50% Catholic, every single provincial district but one voted yes to a clear question. And so we then passed a vote of the legislature, consequently had a lot of resistance, but we passed a vote of Parliament, and we eliminated the denominational education system. Now, I have to be honest and say we did that in Newfoundland because we couldn't afford the luxury of multiple systems. If you ask me as an Ontario resident today and a taxpayer today, which I am, do I think that a denominational system and a public system coexisting side by side is affordable? It's certainly much more affordable here than it was in Newfoundland and Labrador. Are the schools, the Catholic schools here, largely full? I think they are. You couldn't make the same argument I made, that there was an economic case to end the separate school system. But having said that, you ask Mike, so I don't think there's the same urgency. I have to be honest. But if you ask me whether I think that's in the best interest of public policy to have separate school systems, I don't think so. And why would you have a separate school system just for one faith and one faith only? How do you justify that? So in my mind, now I speak only as a citizen and a taxpayer, you know, do I think it's the highest and most urgent matter to be addressed in Ontario? No, I don't, because it's different than it was in Newfoundland. But I think if you, as a community, we should always invest the taxpayers' money, the public money, in the best possible education system we can give our children. And the focus should be more on that than on denominational so-called rights or desires.
Do you think with the changing demographics of Ontario and the diverse population that it will ever be an issue again? I think politically, the three parties are ducking. They don't want to, because we lost an election, John Tory, raising the issue, and what he was saying is, let's bring some more guys in, different religions.
And that was his mistake.
Mistake,
So
terrible mistake.
he was going to take the pizza system, education system, and make it more of a pizza system. He's going to break it into more pieces. Look, here's what I think. I think deep down, the people of Ontario are way ahead of all the politicians. I think that if you actually asked people in a calm, quiet, fact-based manner how they want to spend their education dollar, they would probably say, we want to put our dollars to work in the most effective and efficient way possible. And that probably means a pure public system. You know, it's interesting, after we did the change in Newfoundland, they did it in Quebec as well. They brought about a pure public system. Is it urgent for Ontario? No, it's not urgent. Do I think in time Ontario is going to go to a pure public system? Probably. And by the way, you know, you use the word, we think about the changing demographic of Ontario. I don't think we're dealing with the changing demographic of Ontario. The change is here. It's with us now. Walk around the city of Toronto. This is the most diverse, multicultural, big city in North America. By far.
By far.
We're living the future now. And our education system, our institutions should reflect it now.
So you trust the people of Ontario, which I do as well.
I think the public are generally always ahead of the politicians. That's the truth. And the bet I made in Newfoundland, and I, by the way, told my caucus and told my cabinet that if we didn't win the referendum, I'd resign. I'd resign the same night, rather than have the government weakened by a loss of the referendum. And my bet was that the people of Newfoundland were already there. They were ahead of us.
Econ nature of work is proximate to the environment and community. Keeping this in mind, Econ has created a corporate social responsibility and sustainable policy to create a social impact. Moreover, Econ has taken initiatives such as WAG to strengthen the position of women in the company. According to recent news, Econ Group Incorporation has signed a deal to be acquired for 1.5 billion by CCCC International Holding Limited of China, subject to shareholder and government approvals. This deal is expected to provide benefits to Econ by increasing its capability in terms of capital to bid for complex projects and by enabling it to compete for international projects. My question is, will there be any impact on CSR and Bag initiatives after the acquisition of Econ?
No, not at all. As a matter of fact, one of the reasons I really like this transaction, and just speaking for myself, you know, we talked about the development of Consolidated Thompson Iron Mines. One of the investors of Consolidated Thompson Iron Mines in the crash of 07-08, when the market's completely pancaked, was an SOE out of China who put up $250 million US when there was no money to be had anywhere, at you know, no matter what you did, and allowed us to keep going at a time when we were spending $30 million a month building this thing. And they turned out to be very good partners. They were hands off. They put capital in. They let us go ahead as a management team and continue to build that project. With respect to Econ, the CCCI group has acknowledged publicly, it'll be part of the conditions that we'll put before the Government of Canada for the official review they're going to do on whether this is a net benefit to Canada, that the company will continue to be run, based in Toronto, run by a Canadian management team. The Econ values and core values will remain in place, including those you just mentioned in your question. So we've had, you know, frankly, it wasn't a long or a difficult discussion. One of the things that we did, and if those who are interested in this particular story, we looked at CCCI's record when they bought a company out of Australia. In fact, we had the CEO of that company, the company's name is John Holland, similar to us, similar size, come to Canada and talk to us about what their experience had been. And so what we're going to see basically is a supervisory board of 5 people when this transaction goes ahead. Of the 5, 3 of those will be Canadians. 2 will represent the shareholder. And I want you all to think about this with a business brain, you know, MBAs. Right now in infrastructure development all over the world, the provision of that infrastructure has gone global. So governments have decided that citizens of their countries should get the benefit of the most competitive regime to build infrastructure. So we no longer say if you're going to build a highway or a bridge or an airport or a port in Canada, only Canadian companies may apply. When we used to do that, we got what happened in Quebec. Right? We had the large construction corruption scandal. You know, it was an in-house thing. If you weren't a Quebec company, you couldn't apply. And there was a lot of shenanigans that happened. So governments decided a long time ago, when Canada made the commitment to reinvest in infrastructure that's aging, that's old, that needs to be renewed. And by the way, you know there's like $250 billion now of commitments between the federal government and provincial governments to renew our infrastructure. We decided as a country, we're not going to limit that to Ontario companies or British Columbia companies or Quebec companies. We're going to invite the world to come to Canada. So what that meant for Econ, and by the way, if you look at our helmets, it's got the Canadian flag on it. We're very proud to be a Canadian company. What it meant is suddenly a company that was a big player in Canada is globally a very small player. We are like that big compared to the companies that are now in Canada competing against us. Their balance sheets are massively bigger than ours. The size and scope and capability of the company, massively bigger than ours. So our ability to bid on these jobs, to compete and to win, is limited. We needed to have a bigger balance sheet and a bigger capability, not only to compete on jobs in Canada, but to compete on jobs around the world. And we looked around the world. We talked to many different players. We looked at many different suitors. And for us, the right fit and the right cultural fit was CCCI. So personally, I'm excited. Look, I don't believe for a second that we should take the view anywhere in the world that a company is from India or a company is from China or a company is from somewhere else and therefore we're not going to do business with them. Or we're going to be very tough and difficult and put on unfair expectations on them. Here's the reality, folks. We better accept this reality. China is today, or shortly about to become, the biggest economy in the world, surpassing the United States. That isn't going to change. And we can be a participant as a country with the biggest economy in the world, recognizing they're not perfect, recognizing there are things about them we'd like to change or influence, or we can stand in the corner saying, you're not perfect, we're not playing. At a time when you just had the Canadian ambassador to the United States tell you how difficult it is to do a NAFTA negotiation, I hope explain to you how unreasonable some of their positions are on America First, are we actually going to stand back and say we don't want to do business with China? We're going to make Canada captured or captive to a U.S. agenda that says the U.S. first, last, and always? And we're not going to go out and trade with the rest of the world and develop trading relationships and business relationships and cross-investment back and forth? We would be doing a disservice to Canada. We need to engage with the world, not walk away from it. And so in the context of that discussion and the need for size and scope and scale, you're the engineer in the group, AECON's now in a position to say, we'll not only compete effectively in Canada, but we'll compete around the world. We'll take young Canadians, educated, smart, hungry, ambitious, that have no sense that they can't compete and win, and we'll put them to work here and around the globe as a result of the transaction we're about to do.
Okay. Jason?
In your autobiography, you credit some of the decision-making associated with the 1994 interception by our Navy and Coast Guard of the Spanish vessel suspected of using an illegal trawl net to the fortuitous presence in your department that day of a Newfoundlander by the name of Max Short. Max is characterized in your book as a classic Newfoundland outport fisherman turned union organizer who just happened to be present to provide his interpretation to you and other senior government officials of what was going through the minds of the Spanish vessel's crew at the moment they were attempting their escape from the Grand Banks, as well as what the perception of Canadian fishermen would be if our government failed to intervene, with the embellishment that it will haul the guts and soul right out of them if we don't stop that boat, and therein solidifying your government's resolve to fire across the Spanish vessel's bow in an effort to halt her escape. The narrative seems just too perfect for me, so my question is, did Newfoundland everyman Max Short really play such a pivotal role in this important event in Canadian history, or was there a certain amount of artistic license involved in how it was conveyed in your book so as to appeal to your constituents?
So Max was there when this decision was made, because I hired Max. When I first became Minister of Fisheries, one of the first things I did was I went and hired the guy who was the union, he was working for the union. He was the union organizer for the Great Northern Peninsula. The Great Northern Peninsula of Newfoundland. The place where the Vikings landed, and where the crab and cod and all the rest were hauled up in abundance on the shores of those rural and coastal communities. So Max Short is a guy that's about 5'3", never had a drink of alcohol in his life, worked like a son of a gun. He had the Pope on one picture on his wall, and he had Rocket Richard on the other picture. And he's the real McCoy. He's brilliant, he's passionate, he's compassionate, he has a great intrinsic knowledge of the fishery, he has guts and courage. He's not just a yes man on behalf of his membership, he's prepared to tell them when they're wrong and they're foolish and they're expecting too much. And he was singularly the most important advisor I had in the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. A lot of brilliant and bright people, but the person who was with me before I made the call every time on any major public policy issue that affected people where they lived in fishing communities was Max Short. So honestly, I can tell you, I'm proud to tell you, because I'm very proud of Max, that he's the real McCoy, just a wonderful guy. And we were sitting in a control room that we'd set up. And we had the military, we had D&D, we had the Coast Guard. I had Jim Bartleman, the Prime Minister's foreign policy advisor. I had my deputy minister, and you know we were live by satellite to a DFO vessel, and we were talking about whether or not we were going to take the step to shut this boat down that was running for international waters. In fact, it had run out of Canadian waters, so it was fishing illegally. Think about this. It was massively destroying fish, illegal nets, Canada, being the good Boy Scout we are, of course, would never do anything but other than say to people, excuse me, but you're not doing that quite right. And so we have this new policy of we're cutting your bloody nets. Because what we understood is there's only one incentive for illegal fishing: money. And if you're allowed to fish illegally and reap and rape and destroy important spawning grounds, and you can find a place to sell that product, notably in Portugal and Spain, and you make millions and millions and millions of dollars, if once in a while we catch you and give you a little fine, hey, it's good business, right? It's cost-doing business. We'll pay the fine. But what we were doing was different. We were actually cutting the nets that are worth hundreds of $1 million a net, and we were arresting the vessels and dragging them in the port. We were stopping them from doing what they're doing. We were killing the economic incentive by hopefully bankrupting whoever these owners were of these vessels. So what Max was saying at the time when people were hesitating, what do we do now that we've cut the vessel's net, the vessel's running away, because we want to arrest it too? And my question to Max was perfect. I said, Max, what do you think they're thinking and saying? And of course, you read the classic answer. And literally in that moment, I took a piece of paper and signed it and said, we're going to arrest these guys. We're going to go. By the way, just so you know, that particular ship, we sent a crew of RCMP officers over the side of the boat, and the crew dumped them back in the ocean. Their guns, their weapons, their Uzis, everything. We had to rescue the RCMP. Then we got a volunteer crew of mostly Newfoundlanders who worked on a Coast Guard vessel who weren't armed, weren't trained. They went over the side and they stopped the damn boat. Of course, we did pump some 50 caliber machine gun bullets across the bow of the boat, told them we didn't stop. We'd take out the prop next. It's a real story. He's a real guy. And it changed internationally, not just fishing off Canada's coast, but it changed the law of the sea. And as a result of all that, to sue for peace, we went to the UN and we negotiated an amendment to the law of the sea that gave every coastal nation state the right to stop, high-speed, deep-sea pirates, and to call upon the state from which they came to come and arrest them and bring them back and prosecute them. And absolutely, it'd be nice to stand up and say it was all my idea. I'd love to be able to do that, but I got to tell you, I couldn't look Max short in the eye and through him the eyes of many other people in all of coastal Canada if we didn't put the brakes on these guys. So we did. So I wish he was on the line. He'd charm all of you right to death. He's just a sweet guy.
I want to thank you for being here. You've got some time to spend, and this is the guy to talk to. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. I really enjoyed being with you today. Thank you.